So welcome to this session. I'm going to be talking about how Adobe Managed Services runs AEM on Azure. Anybody here running AEM on Azure currently or are interested in running it in the next few months? You are? Okay. All right. What about AEM on the cloud? Anybody running AEM in the cloud? AWS maybe? Anybody on Google platform? AEM on Google? No? Okay. Very good. All right. So just to give you an idea about what we're going to be talking about. So I'm going to set the context of how we in Managed Services ended up running AEM on Azure. Then I'll talk to you about what we did before that big first customer go live. And then maybe afterwards, 10 pointers to you in terms of some of the guidance to you, some takeaways for you, but since at least you, in your case, you're thinking about running AEM on Azure. So in terms of context, myself, I work as a cloud engineer in the Managed Services team. And the Managed Services team itself is basically about 200 plus people globally. We have about 600 plus customers. 130 of them are on Azure today and growing. So we have about 2,000 virtual machines on Azure and all the associated stuff. Like if you think about for every VM, there will be at least a couple of disks involved. 1/3 of those VMs will be in terms of virtual networks and all of that stuff. We have a CSE model. Anybody familiar with Adobe Managed Services itself? You are? Okay. Okay, got it. So it's a team within Adobe that basically takes the AEM, the product, puts it on a cloud, AWS or Azure, customer choice, and then we run it as a managed service for the customer. And we assign a particular named person named CSE, a customer success engineer. And that is a single point person for you for everything AEM. So that's the number you call when you have any problem regarding your AEM deployment. We have, Adobe being a global company, we have offices in San Jose, Lehigh, Utah, London, Bucharest, Romania, Delhi, Bangalore, and Sydney, and we have CSEs in all of those offices. So if you have a deployment that covers the whole globe, we can provide 24/7 coverage. The whole Azure deployment thing started back in September 2016 when the CEOs of Adobe and Microsoft made a joint announcement at Microsoft's Ignite conference in Atlanta about a strategic partnership. And if you're interested in it, there's a couple of links I have down there. I'm pretty sure Trisha will be posting the slides afterwards. So you can watch the video. About 11 minutes into that big keynote, you can actually see the announcement. So Adobe then chose AEM as one of the vanguards of products that will be getting on Azure. So we got to work. And in terms of the partnership itself, what it really means is that we have one of the highest levels of support that Microsoft offers called Premier Mission Critical. We also have assigned solutions architects from Microsoft that we work with. There's one dedicated to AEM, by the way. We also have a named liaison from Microsoft that gives us a kind of a direct line into Azure engineering and product management. So the first customer went live in October 2017. So that means we were able to get our first customer live on Azure within 1 year of that big announcement. And as I mentioned, since then, we've had 130 customers and growing. So now getting into what we did before that first customer go live happened. Before getting into the details, I guess some of you might be interested in the current state of infrastructure as a service. So, do I have that open? There you go. So this is a public website called mspoweruser.com. And, oh, I'm unable to show that. You know what? I'll have to, oh, there it is. So I don't know if you can see it at the back, but basically, where you want, first of all, you notice that it's not a very crowded field. This industry is really consolidating. There's only a few players left in this space. And you can see the big players there. And as you know, I don't know if you're familiar with Gartner's Magic Quadrant, but where everybody wants to be is in the top right corner, right, the leader. So you can see where things are in terms of Gartner's opinion of how Amazon and Azure and Google are doing. Let me move that out of the way. Okay. It's a little awkward here. All right, so in terms of our use of Azure, we use it predominantly as infrastructure as service. We don't use the platform as a service options that Azure offers, purely IaaS. That means all of these things. And if you look at the Azure services through your knowledge of how AWS works, I have some analogies there. So when what Azure calls a managed disk is basically an EBS volume in AWS parlance. And what Azure calls a blob storage container is basically an S3 bucket. And what everybody knows as a ELB or an ALB in AWS is called an application gateway in Azure. So as part of our own evaluation of Azure, we did a whole series of tests all the way down to the infrastructure. So we have used Sysbench to test the CPU performance, memory performance, storage performance. So, when it comes to storage, there's two different types of workloads, right? There's a sequential writes and reads and the random writes and reads. So we use two different tools for that. For sequential tests, we used a tool called DD in Linux, and the random tests were done on Sysbench. Then we did some testing of AEM itself. So we have this one test where we ingested about 6,000 1 megabyte JPEGs and 4,005 megabyte PNG files together at the same time into AEM. And then we measured how long it took for those to first get uploaded, and then how long it took to process the workflows. And you can get that data from the error log of AEM. And then we tried a package install, something we all do, something that can be slow. So we had a fairly big package built that had about 300,000 page nodes, and we installed it and took note of how long it took on Azure, on a VM running in Azure. And then the ACS tools package comes with a particular tool called a test page generator. It can actually create millions of test pages. So we created 2 million pages and measured how long that took. And then using a WebDAV client, we ingested 1 megabyte PDFs into the system to see how long that took. And as you know, in the case of a PDF, which is very text heavy, all of that text has to be extracted out and indexed, right? So that has a heavy load on the system as well. So this is all the suite of tests that we did on AEM. We did search testing. So all of these things we put into AEM, then we actually queried for and measured how long it took for AEM to give us back the results. And in addition to all of this is all managed services, the operational guys. The engineering team also did a lot of product validation on Azure. For example, they built a assets repository, a 125 terabyte repository, and then they did a bunch of their automated test suites to see how long each of those things took. And eventually, we basically came to a choice in terms of what type of VM family we want to use on AEM. And there's a lot of options out there in Azure as well as AWS. And this is interesting because we ended up choosing something called a DSV2. The D series in Azure is basically the general purpose VMs. S indicates to you that the VM, you can actually attach an SSD capable disk to that VM. That's what the S stands for. And obviously V2 stands for second version. There's a version 3 out right now. The reason we ended up choosing an older version V2 is very interesting because we found that the performance of AEM on V2 was about 30% better. And it's kind of counterintuitive because V3 is newer. And our current theory, which has been proven, is the fact that on V2, the hosts don't have hyperthreading enabled. And if you have hyperthreading enabled, what typically happens is, let's assume the picture on the right side is a single socket of a CPU. I'm getting into hardware weeds here, but a single socket, it has 4 cores. Those are the white, the big boxes up here. Single physical core, right here. If you enable hyperthreading, what happens is that they actually expose what are called 2 logical cores to your VM. And so when you say, give me a VM that has 2 virtual CPUs, you're really getting a single core and 2 logical cores right there, that machine. If you choose a machine that doesn't have hyperthreading turned off here, so it would only expose as physical cores, your VM, if you ask for a VM with 2 vCPUs, you actually get 2 physical cores. A lot of people don't know this, but we believe that this 30% performance improvement we were seeing for AEM is because of that. So we are very happy. We've been running things for 2 years now on Azure. We are very happy with the performance we get on the DSV2. Yes? Yeah.
What JV insights do you have for AEM? Because AEM performance increases generally when you provided a certain memory depending on which cloud.
That's right. Our testing was all done on a particular VM type on DS called a DS3 V2. And so a DS3 has about 4 CPU cores and 16 gigabytes of memory. And in terms of the JVM itself, for a 16 gigabyte machine, we actually provide 8 gigabytes of heap size for AEM. The rest we leave it for caching and so on. Yeah. So that was our choice of VM based on all of the testing. That's what we still run with. And then we tested the network bandwidth between availability zones within a single region. So we tested it in West US2, which is somewhere in Washington. They don't tell you the exact details, obviously. And we were able to get, I don't know if you can see it, but we were able to get about 2.5 gigabits per second throughput between 2 VMs in 2 different availability zones in the same region. And these availability zones can be up to hundreds of miles apart. I mean, that's the whole idea of an availability zone, right? And then we tested a network throughput between 2 regions. So this one is across the US, one in West US2, Washington, the other Washington State, the other one East US2 in Virginia. And we were able to get about, we're using iPerf here, we were able to get about 328 megabits per second throughput. I mean, for going across the US, that's pretty good. And again, this depends on the VM a lot, so that the higher capacity VMs tend to have more network throughput, so you might get different numbers if you were to test with a different VM. But this is a DS3 V2. In terms of our own deployment architecture, we treat every customer as a single tenant, meaning each customer gets their own what's called an Azure subscription, which is really a natural security boundary in Azure. And then what we do is, within that subscription, we map environments like QA, test, development, staging, prod, to what are called resource groups, which are basically containers that you can deploy things into. And that's basically our model. So there will be a stage resource group, a prod resource group, and you can actually isolate network traffic between those using VNet security rules. And also we have an automated provisioning tool. So we have a tool whose front end is actually AEM, called MS Central. And a CSE can go in there and pick and choose a bunch of choices and can have a complete AEM environment fired up within about 2 hours. I mean 6 publish instances and 6 dispatchers, and 2 authors, and all of the virtual networks and disks and replication agents and the firewall rules we can all do that. It's all automated. And what we really do is Azure has a Java SDK, so we use that SDK to talk to Azure. And Azure has something called an ARM template, an Azure Resource Manager template, which is very similar to AWS's CloudFormation. If you're familiar with that, it's an XML file where you get to completely define your cloud deployment in terms of XML. So, using the Azure SDK, we give the ARM template to Azure, and then Azure goes and builds the whole thing for us. And then once the VMs are fired up, then we use Chef to configure things further, in the VMs. So that's our model. So one of the things that you have to do when you go to a new cloud provider is make some changes to the product. In this case, the only major change we had to make was to the connector, because we already had an S3 connector, and we had to build one for Azure's blob storage, which is their version of object storage. So that's the only major change, only major new feature that we had to build into the product. So in version 6.5, this connector already comes with the product. You don't have to install anything new. And the version of the connector in 6.5 is 1.10.2. We have AEM Cloud Manager, which is a feature we offer only on Adobe Managed Services. It's not really part of the product. It's a separate additional service we provide to our customers called Cloud Manager. It's basically a CI/CD service. And that uses a few additional Azure services called the Logic Apps, which is kind of an orchestrator of various Azure services. And then we use Azure container instances. Containers are really very popular these days. We like the fact that the Azure container instances we can easily quickly fire them up, make them do create a bunch of load on the target AEM system, and kill them afterwards. And we also use Azure Functions, which is this serverless functions as a service service. So we have about a year of experience with Cloud Manager. We have several customers on it, and overall, we are pretty happy with how Logic Apps is doing the job for us. And the only thing, as a takeaway for you, is when you build things on containers, you really have to think about how you're going to debug if there's a problem, and how you're going to build in observability of these things. That one can be trickier. So if there's one takeaway that we have for you, it's that. If you're going to use containers, observability, make it a high priority. The other thing that commonly comes up is direct connectivity between the customer's on-prem premises to Azure. So on Amazon, you have something called Direct Connect, which is this dedicated private line directly into the cloud provider. So Azure has something similar called ExpressRoute. But the thing to note is that the setup of an ExpressRoute circuit is strictly between the customer and their ISP and Microsoft. We, as Adobe, don't really have a role to play there, but people get confused about ExpressRoute, how it works. The thing to note is that setting up ExpressRoute itself takes months. It's not a straightforward thing to do. It usually takes months to set up. But once it is set up and is in place, for us, the only thing we need to do is set up what's called an ExpressRoute gateway. And that's very straightforward, quick to do. We need a couple of pieces of information from the customer. And then once that's done, we're pretty much good to go. So that allows us, our AEM instances deployed in Azure, to talk through a private, dedicated, leased line to on-prem systems, back-end systems. So some of our customers use ExpressRoute. In terms of infrastructure redundancy, there is a little bit of confusion out there between availability zones, which everybody understands. In AWS, it's a given, and availability sets. So Azure today, in all of its regions, don't have availability zones yet. Only a few regions have that, more coming. So in a region, if you have to deploy to a region where they don't have availability zones, Azure has a feature called an availability set, and that is not as robust as availability zones are, for sure. The idea is that if you had 3 publish instances, for example, you would deploy them together into what's called an availability set. And if you do, then Azure promises that they will make sure that they take those 3 nodes and make sure that they will deploy it across separate racks, but in the same data center, right? That's a big catch. But they will make sure that any single rack failure, you will survive. So that's an availability set. So if you are in a region without any zones, takeaway is please think about and deploy into an availability set at least. And in cases where you have a region that has availability zones, you still can use availability sets. So people get a little confused about that. Microsoft's guidance to us is just choose one over the other. So if you have AZs, choose AZs. In terms of looking ahead for some of the new things coming, containers. It's something we are looking at. Then there's this other service that's coming up called Azure Front Door. This is very interesting because Front Door is an interesting service which is a kind of a combination of a load balancer and a CDN. So, instead of having to manage two services, you get to manage one service. We don't know a whole lot about it right now, but something that we are keeping an eye on. And then there's Azure Stack. This one's interesting. If you sign up for that one, you will have to call a preferred vendor of Microsoft. It could be HPE, Lenovo, Cisco. Now, there's a few others too. They will send you a rack of that hardware to your data center. It shows up at your data center. Your IT guys can hook it up to power, networking, and air conditioning. And you turn it on. It's got Azure running on it. And if you do all of the integration work, it'll show up as a region in your Azure portal. So you have complete control of your Azure environment because it's on-prem. You totally control it. But you have Azure stuff, Azure VMs, managed disks, all of that. So that is very interesting to some of our customers, especially people who don't want to put their stuff in the public cloud. So we are keeping an eye on that as well. So takeaways, advice for you. I have 10 of them. Number one is running a lot of tests, comparing cloud providers is probably not necessary because at least in the past 2 years of experience, what we have seen is the choice of a cloud provider is a business decision. People usually don't take it based on some performance reason. Oh, somebody is 10% better than the other guy in a particular service. That usually, I haven't seen it happen. So it is a business decision. Don't waste a lot of time going crazy on technical performance testing. It's probably not worth it. They're pretty much all converging in terms of their capabilities, and the differences are pretty nuanced. Number two, Azure, compared to the other cloud providers, has this strategy of having a presence in as many countries as they could, which means that where your customer is, there probably is an Azure data center there. Whether it has availability zones or not, different story. So you have to find where your users are, like the AEM authors especially, because AEM author workload is very sensitive to latency, right? Because you go and do a lot of back and forth. So you want to basically find out where your users are and then decide which region to deploy. So there's a couple of tools out there. I have it down there. One of them is called www.azurespeed.com that you can get your users to run, and it'll tell you their nearest Azure data center. So you can give that URL to like 10 users and kind of get a feel for what the nearest data center is. I can do that demo afterwards if I can get all the screens to cooperate. But anyway, so takeaway for you is deploy where your users are. Don't let other considerations affect it. Number three, Azure has a concept of a Canary region, which is kind of a test region that they use to test their own stuff. So you can actually deploy AEM there, and then they actually give you heads-up warnings on, hey, this thing is going to go down at a certain time on a certain day. So you can actually test your AEM deployment for, let's say, an availability zone loss and see if all of your health checks and load balancing all still works. One of the things that we really found very interesting was when we tested it for the first time, our deployment worked great. And AZ went down, failover worked, everything was great. Then the AZ came back, and in our first test, our systems did not detect the fail back. So a lot of people forget this stuff. They all test fail over and declare victory, go home, but don't, because you want to test fail back as well, because that has to be automated too. Big learning for us, we fixed our health checks and some other stuff, and so made sure that that worked. Number four, if you have a choice, choose a region with availability zones. And then, some people worry about, okay, if I deploy author on AZ1 and deploy publisher in AZ2, how is that going to look like in terms of latency? Will replication take too long? In our experience, that is not a major concern because Microsoft really tries to make the latency between two availability zones about 2 milliseconds. And if you think, if you do some mathematical calculations of how far light travels in a millisecond, that's about 186 miles or so. So you can have two AZs that are separated by 200 miles and still have a latency less than 2 milliseconds, which if I did some comparison yesterday, the distance from San Diego to Los Angeles is more like 200 miles. So they could potentially put an AZ anywhere between here and Los Angeles and still have a big region, So yeah. Takeaway number 5, pay attention to quotas and limits. Anybody who's worked with some of the cloud providers know that, the marketing talks about unlimited resources, but really it's not really unlimited, right? So, for example, on AWS, you could actually try to fire up one of those rare instances and say, I need 300 of them. Chances are they'll tell you, no, right? We don't have 300. So quotas and limits do exist, and you have to pay attention to them. So one big one for Azure is, there's a limit of 200 subscriptions in an account. So if you have more than 200 customers, then you need to create a separate account, which you can totally do, but you have to keep track of it. And many of these are soft limits. You can actually call Microsoft and say, we need more VMs of this type, and they usually turn it around very quickly. So it's not really a big deal. Takeaway number 6 is, I have a typo there, application gateway load balancer. When we started, they had a V1 of the application gateway. That had a problem, which was if you make a configuration change, it took like 15, 20 minutes sometimes to take. We don't really know all of the reasons for it, but that was very concerning. But since then, they have come out with application gateway V2, where that problem doesn't exist. So if you run into a situation where you had a choice between the two, V2 is the way to go. Don't use V1. And there's also a few other things you want to keep track of because V2 load balancers, they auto-scale for you up and down, but that auto-scaling agility has limits. You know what I mean? So if you have a workload where it has to scale up crazy high very quickly, then you might want to test that, whether it can actually be agile enough to do that for you. And then, auto-scaling itself, the upper limit is 125 nodes for auto-scaling. I don't think anybody wants that, because if you come under a DDoS attack, you might end up with a really big bill at the end of the month for no good reason. So you probably want to limit the upper range of your auto-scaling for financial purposes. Takeaway number 7. AEM produces a lot of logs, and many people already have log indexing like Splunk in place, so it's not really a concern. But if you don't, Azure offers a really good service called Log Analytics. That is pretty good. They have a really good syntax. You have to learn that syntax, but it's not very hard to learn. But you can do a lot of really good analytics on Log Analytics, and they produce nice charts, a lot of insights, and so on. A lot of people don't know about it, so that's why I'm kind of talking about it. Especially for application gateway logs and CDN logs, because those tend to be really big, and it's not easy for us to, you'll have to build special tools to do that otherwise. Takeaway number 8, people get confused between Azure container instances and Azure Kubernetes service, both being container service offerings. So what we have learned is that if you have a very short-lived workload, use Azure container instances like we do for our CI/CD service. But if you have a longer-running workload where the publish instances, which is hopefully going to stick around for months or years at a time, then you want to look at the Azure Kubernetes service, the AKS. Our own cloud manager uses Azure container instances, as I mentioned. But we did run into one problem with these containers, and that was a weird combination of a timeout on a load balancer and how Maven behaves. But anyway, we had to actually configure Maven, especially what's called the wagon provider for HTTP. I didn't even know such a thing existed within Maven, but we had to fix its own behavior, which is a connection polling behavior, to make it all work because we were hitting some problems. Takeaway is, if you're going into the container world, you're going to run into a bunch of issues that you don't run into in the VM world. So be ready for that. Takeaway number 9, in terms of storage tools, if you are a command line person, everything is great, but a lot of people are not. They prefer a GUI tool. And so Azure has a really functional desktop client tool called the Azure Storage Explorer, which is multi-operating system. There's one for Windows, Linux, Mac OS, and it's very, very nifty. You can drag and drop things into the Azure blob container by just dragging it in from your desktop. You can copy between regions using that. Very, very performant tool. So I would highly recommend if you end up using Azure Blob Storage. They also have another tool called AZ Copy, which is a CLI command line tool. Very useful when you want to transfer terabytes of content between Azure regions. Or between, let's say, wherever your assets are today into Azure or out. And finally, final takeaway, AEM totally works on Azure. And so if you're sitting on the fence as to whether, hey, I don't know if that really works on Azure or not, it totally works. We've been running it for a couple of years, and we've had gaps in features that we worked with Microsoft on over the past 2 years, but at this stage, it's fully functional. You can totally deploy AEM production workloads on Azure.